The auctioneer's gavel had already fallen twice on empty air before most people in the crowd even bothered to look at her anymore. The town of Coldwater Crossing sat at the edge of the known frontier, where the pine forests grew so dense they swallowed daylight whole, and the mountain ranges beyond were still largely unmapped on any honest cartographer's scroll. It was a town of mud streets and rough-hewn timber, of men who smelled like pine sap and iron shavings, and women who had calluses thick as boot leather from years of homesteading. It was the kind of place where strangers were regarded with suspicion, and where anything outside the ordinary was met first with fear, then with scorn, and only rarely with anything resembling decency. On this particular Tuesday morning in early autumn, the town square was crowded. The weekly market had brought in traders from the Eastern Valley settlements, farmers looking to barter surplus grain, and a few itinerant sellers who carted their wares along the mountain trails and stopped wherever there was coin to be made. The air smelled of wood smoke and turned leaves, and the faint tang of the tannery that operated just east of the main road. At the center of the square stood a raised wooden platform that doubled as a public auction block. Today it was being used for what the town administrator, a narrow-shouldered man named Aldrich Mercer, called an indentured labor arrangement. Most people in Coldwater Crossing called it what it was, which was bondage dressed up in polite language. Standing on that platform, wrists bound before her with a rope of coarse hemp, was Snaga Frostwolf. She was 23 years old and tall for an orcish woman, with broad, strong shoulders and a frame built for endurance rather than delicacy, though she carried herself with a stillness that had nothing of submission in it. Her skin was the color of deep forest moss after rain, a rich, dark green that caught the autumn light and held it in a way that made her look almost luminous against the drab brown of the square. Her hair was black and thick, and braided back from her face in a single long plait that fell between her shoulder blades, held with a cord of brown leather. Her tusks were modest by orcish standards, curving upward from her lower jaw just far enough to give her face a gravity that strangers often mistook for menace. Her eyes were the amber gold of firelight seen through dark glass, sharp and aware, and presently fixed on some middle distance that was not the crowd, not the auctioneer, not anything visible to anyone else. She was dressed in a fitted leather bodice dyed a deep umber, laced tightly up the front with rawhide cord, the kind of practical garment that a working woman wore when she expected to move fast and carry weight. Beneath it she wore a blouse of rough linen in a dark cream that had seen better days but was still clean, the collar open, the sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her trousers were dark canvas, tucked into worn knee-high boots that had been resoled at least twice. A belt of braided leather cinched her waist, fitted with small loops that had once held tools or weapons, though both were gone now. She looked like someone who had been taken mid-journey and stripped of everything useful, which was more or less exactly what had happened. 3 weeks prior, Snaga had been captured by a patrol of border militia while crossing through the contested land between the Frostwolf clan territory and the human settlements. She had been traveling alone, which the patrol leader had decided was reason enough to suspect her of scouting. No evidence of wrongdoing had been found on her person. She had broken no law that existed in writing anywhere. But the captain of the patrol had sold her to a trader who had brought her west, and the trader had sold her to Aldrich Mercer's market administration, and now here she stood, on a platform in a town she had never visited, being offered to whoever would pay for her labor. The crowd was not buying. This was not entirely surprising. Orcs were not common in Coldwater Crossing, and the few who had passed through had done so quietly and quickly, usually as part of trading caravans where they were at least nominally protected by association. A lone orcish woman on an auction block was something different. The townspeople looked at her the way they looked at a storm coming down from the mountains, with a mixture of awe and unease and a strong desire to be somewhere else when it arrived. Strong back, capable hands, Aldrich Mercer was saying in his professional auctioneer's cadence, which he had learned from his father and which conveyed absolutely no moral discomfort. Suitable for farm labor, heavy hauling, clearing land. The indenture term is set at 2 years, during which time she will be housed and fed in exchange for her work. Starting bid, 10 silver. Do I hear 10 silver? Silence. A child in the crowd whispered something to its mother and was shushed. 8 silver then. 8 silver for a strong worker. Any takers? More silence. A few people at the edges of the crowd were already drifting away toward the vegetable stalls. Snaga did not look at the auctioneer. She did not look at the crowd. Her jaw was set and her breathing was slow and deliberate, the kind of breathing a person does when they are working very hard to stay contained inside themselves. Her bound wrists rested against her thighs. Her amber eyes were fixed on the mountains visible above the rooftops to the north, the blue-gray peaks that were already dusted with the first snow of the season. 5 silver. Surely someone wants a worker for 5 silver. This is a bargain, people. Nothing. Someone coughed. A dog barked somewhere behind the tannery. Mercer lowered his gavel and looked out at the crowd with the expression of a man who has encountered a problem he was not paid enough to solve. "Last call," he said, without much hope. "Any bid at all, 2 silver, 1 silver." The silence stretched long enough that Snaga's eyes finally came down from the mountains and she looked at the crowd for the first time. She looked at them the way a person looks at a thing that has already decided to hurt them, without surprise, without appeal. She had stopped asking the world for mercy several weeks ago, and then, from somewhere toward the back of the crowd, a voice said, "I will take her." The voice was quiet, but it carried. It was the kind of voice that was accustomed to being heard in open spaces, pitched for wind and distance rather than for enclosed rooms. The crowd turned, and in turning parted slightly, and Jacob Doyle walked forward. He was 27 years old and built like a man who had been doing hard physical labor since he was old enough to swing an axe, which was accurate. He stood just over 6 feet tall, with dark brown hair that was slightly too long and showed at the collar of his canvas work coat, and brown eyes that were the color of good river soil. His jaw was clean-shaved this morning, which was unusual, and his hands were large and scarred in the particular way of a man who worked with tools. He was dressed in practical frontier clothing, a wool-lined canvas coat worn open over a gray flannel shirt, dark trousers tucked into heavy boots, a wide-brimmed hat pushed back on his head. He carried no weapon visible, though a hunting knife rode at his left hip in a worn leather sheath. He walked through the parted crowd with his hands in his coat pockets and stopped at the base of the auction platform and looked up at Aldrich Mercer. "What is the final bid?" 1 silver, Mercer said, sounding deeply relieved that this particular problem was about to become someone else's. "Done." Jacob reached into his coat and produced a single silver coin which he set on the edge of the platform. "Cut her loose." Mercer was already gesturing to his assistant with the rope knife before the coin had settled. Snaga Frostwolf looked down at the man who had just bought her, and something moved through her amber eyes that was difficult to name. It was not gratitude, not yet. It was something more like the feeling of having braced for an impact, and found that it had not arrived. The rope fell from her wrists and she rubbed one against the other slowly, and for the first time in 3 weeks she exhaled fully. Jacob looked up at her and nodded once. "Can you walk all right?" "Yes," she said. Her voice was low and clear and her common tongue was unaccented but precise, the way a person speaks when they have learned a language carefully rather than absorbed it casually. "Good," he said. "My wagon is on the North Street. You do not have to run to keep up." He turned and walked back through the crowd, which parted for him a second time, and Snaga stepped down from the platform and followed him, and neither of them looked back at the square or the auctioneer or the townspeople who watched them go with expressions ranging from bewilderment to quiet disgust. Jacob's wagon was where he said it would be, a wide-bodied freight wagon with high sideboards, pulled by 2 heavy draft horses of mixed color, a gray and a roan. The wagon bed was loaded with supplies, sacks of grain and seed, wrapped tools, coils of rope, a crate of iron fittings. He climbed up onto the driver's bench and took up the reins and waited without looking back at her. Snaga stood beside the wagon for a moment. Then she climbed up and sat on the far end of the bench, keeping a deliberate distance between them. Jacob clicked his tongue at the horses and they moved out. They rode north in silence for the first several miles, leaving Coldwater Crossing behind on a road that deteriorated rapidly from packed gravel to rutted dirt to little more than a track through the grass. The pines pressed in from both sides and the mountains ahead grew larger. The air was cool and sharp with the smell of coming autumn, and somewhere in the trees a raven called twice and was answered by another. Jacob let the silence sit. He did not fill it with questions or explanations. He drove with loose, easy hands on the reins and kept his eyes on the road and occasionally adjusted course to avoid the worst of the ruts. Snaga watched the road too, but she was watching everything around it as well, the tree line, the sky, the road behind them. The posture of a person who has learned that safety is a thing you have to monitor constantly because no one else will do it for you. After perhaps an hour, when the town was fully out of sight and the road had narrowed to a single wagon width with forest on both sides, she said, "What do you want from me?" Jacob considered this. "Labor," he said. "I have a homestead about 4 hours north. I need help with the harvest and the winter preparation. There is more work than one person can do before the snow sets in." "For 2 years," she said flatly. "That is what the indenture says." "I do not hold with indentures," he said. "You can leave when the season is done or before that if you want to. You are not bound to me." She looked at him for the first time since leaving the town, a long, measuring look. "You paid a silver coin." "I did." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. The horses picked their way around a section of road where a fallen branch had made a partial obstruction, and he guided them through it before answering. "Because no one else was going to," he said. "And I did not like what would have happened to you when the auction ended with no bids and they had to decide what to do with you." Snaga looked back at the road ahead. Her jaw worked once briefly and then stilled. "So it was mercy," she said. "Call it what you like," he said. They did not speak again for a long while after that, but the silence had changed quality. It was still watchful on her side, still careful, but something in it had shifted from the hard silence of a prisoner to something more complicated and less resolved. The homestead appeared as the sun was beginning to drop toward the western ridgeline, a clearing in the pines with a log cabin that was solid and well chinked, a barn of good timber, a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the main house, and fields that were partially harvested, the corn stalks dry and rattling in the wind, the potato furrows needing attention, a stand of winter squash waiting along the fence line. It was a working farm, rough at the edges and demanding to look at, but there was something honest about it. The cabin had a good stone chimney already smoking from a banked fire, and the smell of pine and wood smoke and turned earth hit Snaga when she climbed down from the wagon like a physical thing. She stood in the yard and looked at it all. Jacob unhitched the horses and led them into the barn, and she followed without being asked and helped him with the unsaddling and the feeding, learning quickly where things were kept, asking a direct question when she did not know. He answered each one without elaboration but without impatience either, and by the time the horses were settled and the wagon unhitched, they had established a working vocabulary between them that was purely practical but functional. The cabin had 2 rooms. The front room was kitchen, table, and sitting area, with a large stone fireplace and a pair of chairs that had seen years of use. The back room was sleeping quarters with a single broad bed built into the far wall. Jacob showed her around the cabin without ceremony and then pulled a folded bedroll from a chest near the fire. "I will take the barn," he said. Snaga looked at him. "The barn will be cold. I have slept colder." "This is your bed," she said. "I will take the floor by the fire." He opened his mouth to argue and then closed it again, because there was something in her voice that was not request but insistence, and he understood that taking the barn meant she would feel obligated, An obligation on top of everything else she was carrying right now was not something she needed. "All right," he said, and put the bedroll back in the chest. She slept on the floor by the fire that first night, wrapped in a spare wool blanket he gave her without comment, and Jacob took his bed in the back room, and neither of them slept much, but they both pretended to. The next morning she was up before dawn and had the fire stoked and a pot of water heating before he appeared. He looked at the fire and then at her, and said nothing about it but went directly to work. They ate a breakfast of cornmeal porridge with dried apple and then went out into the fields. Jacob showed her what needed doing, and she picked it up faster than he expected, her hands strong and sure, her movements efficient. She could carry twice what he expected, and she did not stop for breaks unless he stopped first, and even then she would continue working with half her attention while she drank her water. She was not trying to impress him. She simply worked the way she was built, at full capacity, because that was how she had always survived. By the third day they had developed a rhythm. By the end of the first week, Snaga had mapped the entire property in her head, knew where every tool was kept, knew which fence posts needed reinforcing, and which section of the root cellar roof was weak and would need shoring up before the deep freeze. She brought these things to Jacob's attention without preamble, pointing them out as they walked the property, and he listened and added her observations to his own, and they planned the work together. He noticed that she never touched anything of his without cause, never went through his things, never pushed past the precise boundaries of what was necessary. She had the discipline of someone who had spent a long time in situations where overstepping a boundary had consequences. It made him careful too, careful of the space around her, careful of sudden movements, careful to announce himself before coming around a corner when she was working nearby. One evening at the end of the first week, they were eating supper at the table, a stew of salt pork and turnips and dried herbs, and Jacob said, without looking up from his bowl, "You do not have to be so careful of me." Snaga looked up. "What? You flinch when I move quickly," he said. "You track my hands when we are talking, you sleep facing the door." He said it without accusation, simply as observed fact. "I am not going to hurt you." She was quiet for a moment. "People say that," she said. "I know, and then they do." "I know that too." He looked up then. "I am not asking you to trust me. I am just telling you what is true." She looked at him for a long moment with those amber eyes that he was beginning to understand held a great deal more than they showed. Then she looked back at her bowl and ate another spoonful. "Your stew is too salty," she said. He blinked. Then slowly he almost smiled. "My stew is fine." "It is not," she said. "Less salt next time." "I will think about it," he said, and there it was, the real almost smile, the one that changed the whole character of his face and made him look younger and less guarded. Snaga looked at her bowl and very carefully did not smile back, but something in her shoulders had come down a half-inch. The weeks moved forward with the inexorable rhythm of frontier autumn. The corn came in, cob by cob, and they shucked it together in the evenings by firelight, the dried husks piling up around their boots. The potatoes came out of the ground heavy and good, and went into the cellar in wooden crates packed with straw. The squash was piled along the south wall of the root cellar. Jacob split wood in the mornings and Snaga stacked it with an efficiency that bordered on architectural, the rows tight and weatherproof. She began cooking on the fourth day, first taking over breakfast, then gradually expanding her domain to include supper as well, and it turned out that she cooked the way she did everything else, purposefully and without waste, and the food got better. She found a jar of dried herbs on the shelf that Jacob had been ignoring and started using them, and the stew got considerably more interesting, and Jacob ate it without comment but cleaned the bowl completely, which she noticed. "You have not said anything about the food," she said one evening. "It is good," he said. "That is all." He looked up. "It is very good," he said. "Better than mine." She considered this. "Yes," she said, "it is." He almost choked on his bread, and she looked at the fire with perfect composure, and he realized she had made a joke, a dry, understated joke with a perfectly straight face. And he found himself laughing, genuinely, the first real laugh he had managed in some time. And the sound of it in the small cabin was unexpected enough that she looked over at him with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite pleasure, but somewhere between the two. They did not speak about where she came from for the first 2 weeks. Then one afternoon, when they were working side by side to shore up the root cellar roof, hammering new timber supports into place, she said without preamble, "I was going to my grandmother." Jacob did not stop working. "The militia patrol stopped you." "They did not ask where I was going," she said. "They did not ask anything, they just put the rope on." "I am sorry," he said. "Your militia," she said flatly. "Not mine," he said. "I pay no taxes to support border patrols, and I never have. They are the governor's militia." She was quiet for a moment, thinking about that distinction. "The Frostwolf clan," she said then. "I do not know if my grandmother is still living. I have been gone 3 weeks from when the patrol took me. She is old." Jacob set his hammer down and looked at her. "When the winter work is done," he said, "I will take you to the clan territory myself if you want." She looked at him, measuring. "Why would you do that?" "Because it is the right thing," he said simply. She held his gaze for a moment, and then turned back to the timber she was hammering and said nothing more. But she worked the rest of that afternoon with a slight ease to her movements that had not been there before, as if something that had been pulled very tight had been allowed a fraction of slack. The town's opinion of the situation at Jacob Doyle's homestead made its way to him, as such opinions always did in small frontier communities, through the medium of the general store. Jacob went to Coldwater Crossing for supplies every 2 weeks, and on his second trip since the auction, the storekeeper Marta Gale leaned on her counter and told him what people were saying with the cheerful efficiency of someone who considers the spread of information a public service. "They are saying you have gone soft in the head," Marta told him, packing his order of salt and flour and lamp oil into a crate. "Reverend Hooks preached something about unnatural arrangements this past Sunday. Half the town thinks you will be dead by spring." "Half the town," Jacob said, watching her pack the crate, "has never left the valley and thinks anything they do not recognize is a threat to them personally. The other half just thinks you are eccentric," Marta said, without missing a beat in her packing. "I am in that half, for the record." "Good," he said. He picked up the crate. "I will need twice the usual salt order in 2 weeks. We are putting up more stores than usual." "Because of the extra mouth to feed." "Because we have more on the property than I usually manage alone," he said, and carried the crate out before she could think of another question. What Jacob did not tell Marta, because it was none of her business, was that the arrangement at the homestead had become something that defied the simple vocabulary of employer and laborer. He and Snaga had fallen into a partnership of the kind that happens naturally between two people who are both capable and honest about what they are capable of. They divided the work not by assignment but by aptitude, each moving toward what they did best and away from what the other handled better, and the farm ran as a result with a smoothness it had never quite achieved when Jacob worked it alone. He began to learn pieces of her. She woke before dawn every morning and spent the first minutes of the day outside regardless of weather, facing east with her eyes open. He asked about it once, gently. She told him it was a Frostwolf clan tradition, the morning acknowledgement, a practice of greeting the day directly rather than letting it arrive unmet. He listened without comment, and the next morning he happened to be outside early as well, not intentionally, but because the horses needed early water, and she was there in the gray pre-dawn, still and upright, and she glanced at him but did not object to his presence. And gradually the mornings became something they shared without making it an arrangement, both of them outside in the cold dawn light, him with his mug of bitter tea and her with her own stillness. He also began to notice things he had not permitted himself to notice in the first weeks when everything was practical necessity. He noticed the way she moved, which was quiet and deliberate and economical in the way of someone who grew up in terrain that required careful footing. He noticed that when she was concentrating, she made a small sound in her throat, not quite a hum, not quite a growl, just a low, sustained note of focus. He noticed that she had a particular laugh, not frequent, not given easily, but when something genuinely amused her, it came out low and sudden and surprised sounding, as if she had not meant to let it out. He noticed the amber of her eyes in firelight. He did not do anything about any of these noticings. He tucked them away carefully and went back to work. 6 weeks after she had come to the homestead, a man rode into the yard on a good horse, which already announced him as someone with more money than most in the area. He was wide in the shoulders and had the look of a man who used authority like a tool he had owned for a long time. He introduced himself as Barton Creel, who owned a large ranch operation in the Southern Valley and had heard, he said, that Jacob Doyle had made a purchase at the Coldwater Crossing auction last month. Jacob was splitting wood in the yard when Creel arrived, and he paused with the axe in his hands and looked at the man on the horse without lowering the tool. Snaga was visible near the barn carrying a load of hay, and she had stopped moving when the stranger rode in, watching from a distance with her body angled toward the open ground rather than toward the man, an old instinct. "I have come to make you an offer," Creel said. He named a figure. It was a fair figure for a laborer, objectively speaking, and Jacob understood immediately that Creel had done some research before riding up. "She is not for sale," Jacob said. Creel looked at him with the patient expression of a man who has found that most things are negotiable. "Now, Doyle, I have got a larger operation than you. She would be better used." "She is not for sale," Jacob said again, and his voice had not changed in volume or tone, but something in it had, something very clear and final, and Creel looked at him for a moment and seemed to take the measure of what he was seeing, which was a man standing in his own yard with an axe in his hands and no negotiation in his face at all. Creel looked over Jacob's shoulder at Snaga, who had not moved from where she stood by the barn. He looked at her the way men like Creel looked at things they wanted and had been told they could not have, with a calculating patience. Jacob stepped sideways, putting himself between Creel's line of sight and the barn. It was a small, deliberate movement, and Creel noticed it. "The indenture papers passed to you at sale," Creel said. "She is your labor property for 2 years. I am offering to purchase that contract." "There is no contract," Jacob said. "She is here voluntarily. Good day, Mr. Creel." Creel sat his horse for a moment longer than was polite and then turned it around and rode back down the track without another word. Jacob watched him go until the sound of hoofbeats faded, and then he set the axe down in the chopping block and turned. Snaga had come partway across the yard while he was watching Creel leave. She stopped when he turned. They were perhaps 8 feet apart, and the wind moved through the yard between them and stirred the dry leaves at the edge of the tree line, and she looked at him for a moment with an expression he had not seen on her before, something open and unguarded, quickly contained. "He will come back," she said. "Probably," Jacob said. "You should let me handle it when he does." "I handled it fine." "You stood between him and me," she said. "Yes, you do not have to do that." "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She looked at him for another moment and then turned and went back to the barn, and Jacob picked his axe back up and went back to the wood, and neither of them said anything further about it. But that evening at supper, the food was exceptional, and she did not comment on it, and he did not comment on it either, and they ate in a silence that was comfortable in a way that was becoming harder and harder to call purely practical. Creel did come back. He came back 3 weeks later, on a cold morning when the first real frost had settled white over the fields, and the air had that particular razor quality that meant winter was no longer a distant prospect but an arriving reality. This time he brought 2 men with him, ranch hands by the look of them, and he did not dismount at the yard gate but rode directly into the yard, which was a deliberate breach of frontier courtesy, and everyone knew it. Jacob came out of the cabin when he heard the horses and stood on the front step. Snaga came around from the side of the barn with a wood-splitting maul in her hands, not raised but not lowered either, just carried, and she positioned herself in the open ground between the barn and the cabin where she had clear sightlines and good footing. Creel looked at her and then at Jacob. "Last offer, Doyle." "Same answer," Jacob said. "My boys here will be happy to help you understand the business sense of this transaction," Creel said, and it was the kind of language that was not quite a threat, but was precisely shaped to convey one. Jacob stepped down from the porch step and walked out into the yard, stopping roughly in the center, between Creel and the cabin. He looked at the two ranch hands, who were big men and knew it, and then he looked back at Creel. "Barton," he said, and his voice was very calm, "if your men get off those horses, I am going to have to put at least one of them down, and then you are going to have to explain to the circuit judge why 3 men rode onto a private homestead and had trouble when they refused to leave. That judge," he added, "is my uncle." This last part was true as it happened. The circuit judge for the Northern Valley District was named Harmon Doyle, and he was Jacob's mother's brother, and everyone in the territory knew that Harmon Doyle had strong opinions about property rights and the sanctity of a man's homestead. Creel's jaw tightened. He looked at Snaga, who was looking back at him with steady amber eyes and the maul still in her hands, and absolutely no indication that she intended to move. He looked at Jacob, who was simply standing there in the cold morning air with his hands at his sides, and the patience of a man who has decided something and does not need to announce it to make it true. Then Creel turned his horse around and his men turned their horses, and they all rode out of the yard and down the track, and this time Jacob was quite sure they would not be coming back. When the sound of them had fully faded, Snaga lowered the maul and set it against the barn wall, and Jacob turned from watching the road and found her already looking at him, and for a moment they just stood in the frost-white yard looking at each other with the cold morning air between them and the mountains north of the tree line catching the early light. "Your uncle is the circuit judge," she said. "He is. You have not mentioned that before." "It did not come up," he said. She looked at him for another moment, and then the corner of her mouth moved, just slightly, and she said, "You are more interesting than you appear, Jacob Doyle." It was the first time she had used his name. He felt it in the center of his chest like a coal catching. "Thank you," he said. "It was not entirely a compliment," she said, and went back to work. The winter descended with the seriousness that the mountains always brought to this part of the frontier. The snow came first as scattered flurries, then as steady accumulation, then as the deep settled blanket that would stay until March. Jacob and Snaga had worked so efficiently through the autumn that the stores were in good order, the root cellar full, the wood stacked high and protected by a lean-to roof, the barn winterized, and the animals settled in their stalls. They were, whether either of them had planned it or named it, ready for winter together. The long evenings began. Dark came early and stayed late, and the fire was the center of everything. Jacob had a good collection of books, more than most frontier homesteaders bothered to maintain, and Snaga worked through them steadily from the shelf, reading with the focused attention she applied to everything. He had a battered fiddle hanging on the wall that he could play competently if not brilliantly, and on evenings when the wind was particularly loud and the snow was coming heavy, he took it down and played, and she listened without comment but never told him to stop. She began to tell him things, gradually, over evenings and meals and the quiet moments between tasks. She told him about the Frostwolf clan, about the winter gatherings and the clan stories and her grandmother, whose name was Usha, and who was the clan's memory keeper, the person responsible for maintaining the oral history that Orcish clans kept in place of written records. She told him about the contested lands and the border treaty that was always being renegotiated and never quite resolved, and about how the militia patrols operated in the gray spaces of that unresolved boundary. She told him about what it was like to be captured and sold as if the simple fact of being a green-skinned woman with tusks was sufficient evidence of being property. Jacob listened to all of it. He did not offer consolation that minimized what she was saying, did not rush to reassure her that not all humans were like that, did not make her experience smaller by contextualizing it into something more comfortable for him. He just listened, and sometimes he said something quietly that acknowledged what she had said, and she found that she could keep talking. In return, without being asked, he told her about himself. About growing up in the Southern Valley, the son of a farmer who had broken this land and built this cabin and died of a chest illness when Jacob was 21, leaving him the homestead and a horse and a crate of books and not much else. About his mother who had died 3 years before that, which had left just the two of them for 3 years, and had made Jacob and his father close in the way that loss sometimes does, two people holding the shape of a family between them. About what it was like to work a farm alone and feel the seasons passing with no one to mark them with. One night in early winter, the snow coming hard outside and the fire built up high, Snaga was sitting in the chair nearest the fire mending a pair of gloves that had split at the seam, a careful, focused work that suited her well, and Jacob was reading in the other chair, and it was so entirely domestic and uncomplicated in its surface that neither of them remarked on it, but both of them felt something in it. Jacob looked up from his book and found her looking at him. Not at the mending, not at the fire, at him. She did not look away when he caught her looking, which was new. She just held his gaze for a moment with her amber eyes, firelit and direct, and then she looked back at the mending. Jacob looked back at his book. He read the same sentence 4 times without absorbing it. That was when he understood, with the particular clarity that men sometimes find when the undeniable arrives, that he was falling in love with her. He had been falling for some time, probably since the morning he had watched her face in the pre-dawn, and understood that her stillness was not blankness but depth. But he had been careful not to look at it directly, because looking at it directly meant deciding what to do about it. He sat with that knowledge for a few evenings and did not act on it and did not speak of it, because he was not a man who moved fast in things that mattered, and because the last thing in the world he wanted was to make her feel like she was being asked to exchange one obligation for another. What eventually broke the careful distance between them was not a grand gesture or a dramatic moment. It was a night in midwinter when Snaga woke from a nightmare that she had not known she was having, the kind of deep and body-level nightmare that pulls you upright before you are fully conscious, gasping, hands braced on the floor, fighting to locate yourself in the dark. Jacob was at her side before he was fully awake himself, sitting on the floor beside her bedroll with one hand hovering near her shoulder, not touching, just present. "You are safe," he said, quietly and without drama. "You are at the homestead. You are safe." She sat with her hands pressed flat on the floor and her breathing ragged and her eyes wide, finding the shape of the room, the fire's low glow, the familiar ceiling of the cabin. Finding him sitting on the floor beside her, warm and solid and completely calm. "I know where I am," she said, but her voice came out rougher than she intended. "I know you do," he said. "I just wanted you to hear it." She looked at him in the low firelight and he looked back at her, and after a moment she said, "You do not have to sit on the floor." "I do not mind the floor," he said. She looked at him for another moment and then very carefully, with a deliberateness that was entirely her own, she reached over and took his hand. Just took it, her large hand around his, and held it. He did not move. He did not tighten his grip and he did not make a thing of it. He just sat on the floor beside her with her hand in his, and they stayed that way until her breathing had fully steadied and the nightmare had gone back to wherever nightmares went. And when it had, she released his hand and lay back down, and he got up quietly and went back to his bed. Neither of them mentioned it in the morning. But the next evening when they sat by the fire, the chairs were slightly closer together than they had been before, and this arrangement was maintained thereafter. The real thaw came slowly, as it always does in mountain country, a degree at a time, the snow retreating to the north-facing slopes while the south-facing ground went soft and workable again. The first weeks of spring were the most demanding of the year on a homestead, everything that had been deferred by snow now requiring immediate attention, and Jacob and Snaga threw themselves into it with the combined energy of people who had spent a winter building up to something and were ready to move. The fields needed turning. The fences needed mending after the weight of winter snow. The barn needed cleaning, and the animals needed their winter supplements replaced with fresh pasture grass, which required the south pasture gate to be rehung where the freeze had swollen it off its pins. Jacob was on the gate and Snaga was passing him the iron pins, and the conversation was practical and task-focused, and then he said, apropos of nothing that had preceded it, "I want to take you to your grandmother's clan as soon as the mountain passes are clear." Snaga went still. "You said that last autumn." "I meant it then and I mean it now," he said, not looking up from the gate. "Late spring when the snow is off the high trail. I know the way to the territory border. I can find the rest." She was quiet for a moment. "You would leave the homestead for that long?" "The homestead will keep," he said. "Your grandmother might not." She handed him the next pin without speaking. He drove it into the gate with 3 solid blows of the mallet and tested the swing. "There is something I want to tell you first," she said. He looked at her. "I do not want to leave," she said. She said it straight, the way she said everything, looking directly at him with her amber eyes. "I do not mean I will not go. I need to see her. But I want you to know that this," she gestured with her hand, a small arc that encompassed the farm, the field, the cabin visible over the fence line. "I did not expect this to become something I wanted to stay in." Jacob set the mallet down carefully. "When you say stay," he began. "I mean stay," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, standing in the soft spring morning with the mud under their boots and the mountains lit by early sun above the tree line, and then he reached out and very carefully, with the same deliberateness she had used that night by the fire, he touched her face. The backs of his fingers along her jaw, just once, gently. She turned into it slightly, just slightly, an involuntary lean that she might not have been aware of. "Then we will go to your grandmother," he said, "and we will come back." "Together," she said, and the word had more meaning than it appeared to, which they both understood. "If that is what you want," he said. "It is," she said. He lowered his hand, and they finished rehanging the gate, and the conversation after that was practical again, but the quality of the air between them had changed permanently. The way the air changes after a storm passes and everything smells cleaner and the light is different. That evening, when the work was done and the fire was lit and supper was on the table, Snaga set a bowl in front of him and he looked at it and said, "This smells extraordinary." "It is the same stew I always make," she said. "It is not," he said. "You added something." "Wild onion," she said. "I found a stand of it along the east fence line this morning." He took a bite and nodded slowly. "You are going to make me completely unable to cook for myself," he said. "You were already unable," she said, and sat down across from him, and he laughed, and she let herself smile this time, the full and genuine smile that transformed her face into something that stopped his breath every time, and they ate their supper together in the spring evening with the mountains darkening outside the window. He kissed her for the first time 2 evenings later. They were at the table with the remains of supper between them, and the conversation had moved from practical to something more personal. Stories from her childhood. A specific memory of her grandmother teaching her to braid clan cord at a summer gathering. The kind of memory she offered him rarely, and he received carefully. She had laughed at something she said, that low, surprised laugh, and she was still smiling when she looked up and found him looking at her with an expression that he had apparently stopped being careful enough to conceal. She looked back at him for a long moment. Then she stood from her chair and came around the table, which was not a large table, and he turned in his seat to face her, and then he stood up too, because somehow they were standing very close together in the small space between the table and the fireplace, and the firelight was behind her and lit the edges of her braided hair. "Jacob," she said, and her voice was low. "Yes," he said, which was not a response to a question but to something else entirely. She reached up and took his face in both her hands the way he had touched her face in the field, with the same gentleness, and he closed his eyes and then opened them again because he wanted to see her, and she was looking at him with her amber eyes from a distance of about 6 inches, steady and direct and without uncertainty. He kissed her, soft and deliberate, one hand coming up to rest at her waist, feeling the warmth of her through the leather bodice and the linen blouse. She kissed him back with a gravity that told him she had decided this as clearly as she decided everything, and the kiss was not brief and it was not timid, and when they finally separated, they were both very still for a moment in the fire-lit cabin with the spring night outside. "I have been wanting to do that for some time," he said. "I know," she said. "You knew." "You are not as difficult to read as you think," she said, and she smiled, and he laughed against her forehead, and she let her head rest there for a moment against his forehead, their foreheads together, his hands at her waist and hers still against his jaw, and the fire crackled and the night was quiet outside and the mountains were dark against a star-filled sky. They traveled to the Frostwolf clan territory in late spring, when the high passes were clear and the roads were dry enough to manage on horseback. Jacob had traded the freight wagon for 2 good riding horses the previous autumn, the gray named Milo and a dark bay he had bought from a passing trader. Snaga chose the bay without deliberation, which told him she knew horses, and they rode north through the pine forests with their supplies packed in saddlebags and a week's food, and the easy companionship of people who had learned each other's rhythms. The days of travel were long and the country was demanding, the trails narrow and sometimes rough, with stream crossings that required care, and one night camped on a ridge when the weather turned, and they sheltered under a tarp strung between pine boughs and listened to rain on the canvas with a fire small enough to stay under cover. They lay side by side for warmth that night, close enough that she could feel him breathe, and he could feel her hair against his jaw when she turned in her sleep, and neither of them pretended it was only about warmth. The Frostwolf clan's summer camp was 3 days' ride north of Coldwater Crossing, in a wide valley between 2 mountain ranges where a river ran cold and clear, and the grazing was good. It was larger than Jacob had imagined, hide tents and bark lodges spread across the valley floor, cook fires burning, children running between the structures, the sound of voices and hammering, and the low rumble of the clan herd being moved in the south pasture. They rode in openly, which Snaga had insisted on. No sneaking, no pretense. She rode straight-backed and unhurried on the bay horse with Jacob beside her, and she spoke in the Orcish tongue to the first clan member who approached them, a young man of about 20 with braided hair and a spear who looked at Jacob with explicit suspicion. There was a tense exchange that Jacob did not follow in detail but read in posture and tone, and then the young man led them deeper into the camp, and other clan members came out to watch, and Jacob kept his hands visible and his posture easy, and did not return the hostile stares he received from several of the older warriors. Jacob Frostwolf was 81 years old and built like a gnarled pine that had survived every winter the range had thrown at it. She was tiny now, the way extreme age sometimes makes people tiny, folded in on herself, but her eyes were still fierce and amber, the same amber as her granddaughter's, and when Snaga came to her and went down on her knees in front of her, the old woman took Snaga's face in her hands and said something in the Orcish tongue that made Snaga's eyes close briefly, and Jacob looked away to give them the moment. He stood in the Frostwolf camp and let himself be looked at, which was not comfortable but was necessary. He was the thing they were trying to understand, the human man who had arrived with their lost granddaughter. He met the looking with steadiness and respect, and did not reach for any of his weapons, which were pieced on Snaga's quiet recommendation before they had ridden in. Usha spoke to him eventually through Snaga's translation, and the old woman's questions were precise and occasionally blunt. What was his clan? What was his father's name? What land did he hold? Did he have other wives? What was his intention toward her granddaughter? Jacob answered each question honestly and Snaga translated, and Usha considered each answer with the patience of someone who had been in the business of understanding humans for 8 decades. At the end of it, Usha said something directly to Jacob, in common with a strong Orcish accent and the particular deliberateness of someone choosing to use a foreign language as a mark of respect. "My granddaughter," she said, "is not easy." "No," Jacob agreed. "She is not. She is worth every hard thing about her." "I know that too," he said. Usha looked at him for a long moment with those old amber eyes, and then she said something in Orcish to Snaga that made Snaga go very still, and then say something in return that sounded almost like a question, and Usha replied with finality and waved a hand. Snaga turned to Jacob and said, with a particular expression he could not immediately parse, "She says you have the face of a man who has already decided." "She is right," he said. "She says if I am going back with you, I should take the clan blessing with me." Jacob looked at Usha and then back at Snaga. "What do you say to that?" Snaga looked at her grandmother, and then at Jacob, and then at the valley spread around them with the mountains above it, and she said, "I say yes." The clan blessing was given the next morning in a brief but full ceremony that Jacob participated in with his hat in his hands and his honest attention. And when Snaga pressed her thumb against his in the closing gesture that Usha directed, he felt it. This thing they were saying yes to. All of it. The permanence and the difficulty and the love underneath both of those things. They stayed with the clan for 4 days. Snaga was restored to her people in a way that was deeper than he could entirely understand from the outside. Conversations he was not part of. Laughter that came from shared history. A grief he saw in her once when she sat with 2 older women who had known someone who had died while she was gone. A grief she processed quietly, and with the contained strength that he recognized as entirely her. He spent those 4 days being evaluated by the clan, with the patient thoroughness of people who take every threat to their kinfolk seriously. And by the time they left, he had achieved something just short of grudging respect from most of the adult warriors and actual friendliness from several of the younger clan members who found him interesting the way young people find anything unusual interesting. The ride home was different from the ride out. Snaga rode with a completeness that had not been there before. Something filled up in her that had been empty, and Jacob felt it beside him and was glad of it. She talked more on the return journey, telling him things about the landscape as they passed through it, Orcish names for the mountains and the rivers, stories attached to certain formations. He listened to all of it and asked questions, and she answered them, and they made camp in the evenings and built fires and ate and talked until they were tired enough to sleep. On the last night before home, camped near the river crossing half a day from the homestead, they sat by the fire after supper, and the conversation had gone quiet in the comfortable way of 2 people who do not need to fill silence. Snaga was looking at the fire and Jacob was looking at her, making no pretense of looking at anything else. She felt the looking and turned to find him watching her, and this time she held it without the quick containment, just let him look and looked back. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I would like very much to not spend another night next to you without it being intentional," he said. She considered this. The fire crackled between them. The river ran dark and quiet beyond the firelight. Somewhere in the trees an owl called. "The bedroll is large enough," she said, with perfect evenness. "That was not exactly what I meant," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then she reached across the space between them and took his hand, the same way she had taken it in the dark of the cabin that night, but this time they were both fully awake and it was entirely on purpose. "I know what you meant," she said. She leaned into him and he put his arm around her and she rested her head against his shoulder, and they sat that way by the fire for a long time, the warmth of the flame on one side and the warmth of him on the other. And eventually, when the fire had burned low, she turned her face up toward his and kissed him, unhurried and deliberate, and he kissed her back with everything he had been holding carefully in reserve. And the night was very dark beyond the fire, and the mountains were dark above the trees, and neither of them was cold. What happened by that fire, quietly and tenderly and entirely of their own choosing, was the culmination of every careful, patient, honest thing that had built between them since an autumn morning on an auction platform in a town that had not wanted her. It was warm and slow and deeply felt, two people choosing each other with full knowledge of what they were choosing, and the tenderness of it was the kind that stays in the body as memory long after everything else has faded. He held her with the care of someone handling something precious, and she let herself be held with a trust she did not give easily and had given entirely. And the stars moved overhead, and the river ran, and the fire died to embers, and they slept close and warm in the frontier dark. The homestead came back to life around them when they returned, as homesteads do, with its particular pressing demands. But something had settled, something final and good, and the small adjustments they made to how they occupied the space together were natural and unannounced. His chair moved closer to hers. The back room became theirs. She began wearing his old work coat on cold mornings because she had said it was warmer than hers, which was true, and he never asked for it back. He rode to Coldwater Crossing in early summer and spoke to the minister there, a younger man than Reverend Hooks who had been brought in after Hooks retired, a man named Galloway who had come from the East and held more progressive opinions about who was entitled to a blessing. Jacob was direct about the situation. The minister was thoughtful and asked two careful questions, and then said that he was willing to perform the ceremony, and that any couple who stood before him and meant what they said was welcome in the eyes of whatever divine power had arranged for this particular frontier to be so complicated and interesting. They were married on a Saturday in late summer, in the yard of the homestead under the open sky, because neither of them was a person who wanted to be enclosed for something this important. Galloway came out from town on his horse, and a handful of people Jacob had worked with over the years came out too. Marta from the general store and her husband, a couple of neighboring homesteaders who had always been decent, and had watched the situation at Doyle's place with quiet approval. From the clan side, Snaga's youngest cousin, a woman named Briga who was 22 and had been one of the friendlier faces in the camp, rode 3 days to attend, and when the cousin arrived in the yard and dismounted and embraced Snaga hard, Jacob understood something about how much that presence meant. The ceremony was brief and honest. Galloway said the traditional words and added a few of his own that were simpler and more direct, and when it came time for Jacob and Snaga to say what they said to each other, they said it plainly, without flourish, because they were both people who considered plainness a form of honesty. He said that he had not expected her and was glad of the surprise, and intended to spend as long as the world allowed him in demonstrating it. She said that she had learned from him that safety could be a thing a person chose to offer freely, and that she chose him in return, every day, which she intended to honor as long as she was capable of honoring anything. Galloway pronounced them married, and someone clapped, and Briga made a sound that was a close cousin to a cheer, and the mountain stood behind it all, and the sky was a deep midsummer blue above the pines. That night there was a fire in the yard and food, and more people than the homestead had ever contained at one time. And Jacob played the fiddle, and Briga knew a clan drum rhythm she beat on a cooking pot with her hands, and Marta danced with her husband in the firelight. And Snaga stood beside Jacob, and he could feel her warmth against his arm. And he looked over at her, and she was looking at the fire with an expression on her face that he had never seen before, fully at ease, all the way down. In a way she had not been since the day he first saw her on that platform. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into it, and he bent and said quietly against her ear, "How are you?" She looked up at him. "I am home," she said. He held her close against his side, and the fire burned, and the frontier night was warm, and the mountains were black and enormous against a sky full of stars. The year that followed was the hardest and the best that Jacob Doyle had experienced. Hard because the homestead demanded constant work, and because the town's opinion of his marriage remained uneven, with a significant portion of Coldwater Crossing regarding the match as at best eccentric, and at worst an affront to the proper order of things. There were looks in the market, A few pointed comments from people who felt entitled to have opinions about other people's lives. Once, a man outside the general store said something directed at Snaga that was crude and designed to sting, and Jacob turned on his heel from 3 steps ahead and came back with a look on his face that made the man take an involuntary step backward, and said, very quietly, that the man should consider more carefully who he spoke to about what and in what company, and the man apparently found the advice persuasive. Snaga had thanked him later privately, not for the intervention itself, which she had not asked for, but for his face when he had turned around, which she said had communicated something unambiguous and satisfying. He had grinned at that, and she had grinned back, full and rare and private. But the year was also the best because of the things that accumulated quietly. The morning light through the cabin window falling across her hair. The way she started humming when she cooked, low and rhythmic, a clan song she had probably hummed since childhood. The evenings by the fire reading, sometimes one book between them, him reading aloud while she mended or worked leather, her correcting his pronunciation when he hit an unfamiliar word, and him arguing the correct reading until she won, which she always did. The small particular pleasures of knowing another person well enough to anticipate them, to have their rhythms inside your own like a second heartbeat. In the second autumn of their marriage, Snaga told him on a morning in early October, matter-of-factly as she always said things, that she was expecting a child. He was in the middle of measuring grain for the cellar, and he stopped with the measuring cup in his hand and looked at her. She was watching him with her amber eyes, and behind the composure was something she was holding very still, something that was either hope or fear or both. He set the measuring cup down and crossed the cabin in 4 steps and took her face in his hands and said, "That is the best news I have heard in my life." And she closed her eyes for a moment and then opened them and said, "You are sure?" And he said, "I have never been more sure of anything." And the thing she had been holding still came undone, and she put her forehead against his, and they stood that way in the grain-smelling cabin, while the autumn light came through the window. The pregnancy was not difficult, which was one mercy, though it was demanding in the ways pregnancies are, and Jacob adjusted the work accordingly without being asked, taking on the heavier lifting, finding tasks that kept her busy without exhausting her, noticing when she needed to rest and manufacturing reasons to stop work at those times without being obvious about it, which she saw through completely and did not call out because she appreciated the effort even if the camouflage was transparent. Briga came down from the clan territory in midwinter and stayed for 2 months, which turned out to be invaluable. She and Jacob had developed a functional friendship by this point, a wary mutual respect built on their shared priority of Snaga's well-being, and a discovered common ground in the area of arguing about things that did not matter, which they both apparently enjoyed. Briga slept in the barn loft, which she declared superior to tent canvas, and learned to cook a few things on the cabin stove, and made Jacob teach her some words on the fiddle, and was generally the most disruptive and welcome presence the homestead had experienced. The child came in early spring. It was a long night, and Jacob did not leave Snaga's side for any of it, and Briga was invaluable in the ways she knew to be invaluable, and Marta Gale turned up unbidden in the morning, having heard somehow, with a basket of food and a brisk competence that proved useful, and when it was over and the new and considerable reality of the situation had settled, they had a son. He was small and loud and immediately furious about being in the world, which Jacob said was a good sign. He had Snaga's amber eyes and Jacob's brown hair, already showing, and his skin was a warm olive that was neither full orc green nor full human tan, but something that was entirely his own. He was the most extraordinary thing either of them had ever seen, and they looked at him with the specific expression of new parents everywhere, stunned and overwhelmed and purely in love. They named him Harlan after Jacob's father, with Usha as his clan name's root, which Snaga had discussed with her grandmother by messenger over the winter. Harlan Usha Doyle, which was a name that contained, like the boy himself, more than one world. Usha came in the summer to see him. She rode in the back of Briga's cart, which was the maximum adventure Briga could persuade her grandmother to attempt at her age, and she sat in the cabin with the baby in her hands, and said something in Orcish very softly that Snaga translated later as an old clan blessing for children born between worlds. A blessing that Snaga said had not been needed for a very long time because such children had been rare, but that Usha remembered word for word because she remembered everything. Jacob watched his son in his grandmother-in-law's arms and felt something move through him that was too large and too simple to have a name. Just the fact of this family, assembled out of a silver coin, and a refusal to walk past something wrong and 2 years of honest work, and the particular courage it takes to let yourself be known by another person. The years moved forward in the way that good years do, with enough difficulty to make them real and enough grace to make them worth remembering. Harlan grew with a speed that routinely astonished both his parents and a temperament that seemed to have inherited the best and most challenging aspects of each of them. His mother's focused intensity and his father's stubborn patience, which made him simultaneously formidable and exhausting to be around, particularly after he began walking. When Harlan was 3, Snaga told Jacob she was expecting again, and this time he was prepared for the news and received it with immediate, unambiguous joy, which made her laugh. Their second child was a girl, born in late summer, and she had her mother's green skin and her father's dark hair and tusks just beginning to suggest themselves, and she was from her first day the quietest, most observant creature either of them had encountered. They named her Marin, a name that was a frontier common name and also close enough to an Orcish naming convention to fit both her parents' worlds. The children grew up knowing both things. Jacob was deliberate about this, about making sure they had access to both the clan culture and the frontier world, taking them to visit Usha every summer while Usha was living, teaching them the frontier skills alongside the Orcish ones that Snaga taught them, making the homestead a place where both were ordinary and neither was secondary. Coldwater Crossing did not entirely come around. Some people never would, which Jacob accepted as a human limitation he could not fix, but could insulate his family from. But others did, gradually and imperfectly, as people tend to do when the thing they feared turns out to be a couple of neighbors with 2 children and a well-run farm who show up at the communal harvest work days and contribute more than their share, and mind their business and treat everyone decently. Marta Gale was a consistent and explicit ally, and she wielded her position behind the general store counter with a partisan ferocity that settled more than one argument before it started. The circuit judge, Jacob's Uncle Harmon, made a point of stopping at the homestead on his northern circuit and eating dinner with them every year, and the social signal this sent was not subtle. Usha died in the 4th year after Harlan's birth, at the end of a winter that had been harder than usual. Snaga received the news by clan messenger and sat with it for a day and then told Jacob, who simply stayed close to her for the next several days without pressing conversation or comfort she had not asked for, just his presence, which was what she needed. They took the children north to attend the clan morning ceremony, and Jacob stood with Snaga through all of it and held Harlan's hand when the boy was confused and uncertain. And afterward Briga sat with them at the clan fire and they talked about Usha until it was very late, and it was hard and necessary and right. She liked you, Briga told Jacob that night, which was the greatest eulogy he could have been offered. I know, he said, I liked her enormously. She said you had the right eyes, Briga said. What does that mean? Briga looked at him. It means she could see that you see her. She glanced at Snaga, that you actually see her. Jacob looked at his wife across the fire, her profile lit by flame, amber eyes open and clear, and he thought about a silver coin on a platform edge, and a rope falling from green wrists, and the first time she had exhaled, really exhaled, standing in a stranger's wagon on a road she did not know, going to a place she had never heard of, and how she had filled that exhale with a whole life since. He did not say any of this. He just looked at her until she felt it and looked back, and the fire burned between them, and the clan mountains were dark above the valley, and Harlan had fallen asleep against his mother's arm. The homestead changed and grew as the years went by. A new room was added to the cabin when the children were old enough to need their own space. The barn was expanded. A second field was broken and brought under cultivation. Jacob built a smokehouse in the autumn of the 6th year of their marriage, a project that Snaga supervised with characteristic precision, and that he completed with the satisfaction of a man building something intended to last. They hired help in the 7th year, a young man named Tomas who came from the valley looking for work, and who turned out to be dependable and quiet, and completely indifferent to the social arithmetic of the household, treating Jacob and Snaga with equal and uncomplicated respect. He stayed 3 years and left only because he had saved enough to buy his own small claim north of the crossing, and they sent him off with good tools and honest references, and the knowledge that he was welcome back if he needed work. The larger world changed around them too. The border treaty between the human settlements and the Orcish clans was renegotiated in the 8th year of Jacob and Snaga's marriage, and this time it held better, partly because a new governor had been appointed, who was less interested in conflict than his predecessor, and partly because the previous decade of gradual contact had produced a generation of people on both sides who had enough experience of the other to find them human in the broader sense of the word, which is to say, recognizable. The militia patrols were restructured to include a joint human-Orcish reporting mechanism that substantially reduced the kind of unilateral action that had put Snaga on that auction platform in the first place. Jacob and Snaga heard about the treaty changes from multiple sources over the course of several months, and discussed them with the informed interest of people with a personal stake in the outcome. And the evening they read the final text in the regional paper that came through the Coldwater Crossing General Store once a week. They sat at the table with the paper between them, and Snaga read certain passages aloud and Jacob listened. And when she finished, she set the paper down and they were both quiet for a moment. "Your cousin Briga helped draft part of this," Snaga said. She had received a letter from Briga 3 weeks prior explaining that she had been selected as a clan representative to the treaty negotiations. "I know," he said. "She is going to be insufferable about it." "Completely insufferable," he agreed and grinned. Snaga looked at the paper and then at him and then somewhere that was not quite either, the middle distance she still sometimes occupied when she was holding something large. "When I was standing on that platform," she said, "I was not thinking about the future. I was not thinking about anything beyond the next hour." "I know," he said. "I did not think there was a future to think about," she said. "Not for me, not there." He reached across the table and took her hand. "And now," she said, and gestured with her free hand at the room, at the fireplace, at the sound of the children talking in the next room, at the window and the yard and the dark pines beyond and the mountains above them all. "And now," he said. She looked at him with her amber eyes, still firelit after all these years, still the deepest thing he knew how to look at. She turned her hand over under his and held it properly. "Thank you," she said. "For standing up." He shook his head slightly. "You would have found your way," he said. "Maybe," she said, "but I found my way here. That was you." He held her hand and did not argue the point, because some things are true in a way that resists revision, and this was one of them. He had stood up. She had exhaled. And every single thing since had been built on those 2 small acts, the offer and the breath, the mercy and the acceptance, the slow and certain accumulation of 2 people choosing each other every day until choice became something else, became the bedrock under everything. The autumn Harlan turned 10 and Marin turned 7. Snaga and Jacob stood together in the south field at the end of the harvest, the last of the grain in, and the squash lined up along the root cellar, the wood stacked and the barn full, and the winter stores counted and good. The sky was the deep October blue of high country late afternoon, and the mountains were lit gold and orange where the aspens ran up the slopes, and the air smelled of pine and cold earth in coming season. Harlan was helping Tomas, who had come back for the harvest season, load the last of the squash, and Marin was sitting on the fence watching with her particular observational intensity, her mother's amber eyes taking in everything with that familiar quiet calculation. Jacob stood beside Snaga with his shoulder against hers, looking at the field and the children and the mountains beyond, and she was looking at the same things, and neither of them needed to say anything. Then she turned and looked at him, and he turned and looked at her, and she had the sun in her amber eyes and a few strands of black hair escaped from her braid blowing across her face, and he reached over and moved them, tucking them back carefully, his hand resting at her jaw for a moment the way it had so many times since the first time, in the spring mud of a field that was now full and harvested and theirs. She put her hand over his. "Next year," she said, "I want to break that north field. The one past the aspen stand." He looked north toward the aspens. "It will take 2 seasons to get it properly cleared. 3 if we do it carefully," she said. "I want to do it carefully. Leave the old trees that are worth keeping." "All right," he said. "Harlan can help," she said. "He is old enough. He will complain constantly. He will complain and then he will do it because he is yours," she said. "He is yours too. He complains like you," she said firmly. He laughed and she smiled, and the children looked over from across the field at the sound of it, and Marin called something that was half a question and Jacob called back that everything was fine, and Harlan made a dismissive gesture that was so entirely his mother's gesture, precise and economical, that Jacob looked at Snaga, and she was already biting back a smile because she had seen it too. They walked back toward the cabin together as the light began to go golden and low, Snaga's hand in his, the children running ahead, the mountains rising behind them into the evening sky, their home warm and lit and waiting. Whatever Coldwater Crossing thought of them, or had thought, or might yet think, was not the truth of them. The truth of them was this: the cleared field and the full cellar and the good cabin and the 2 children who were both worlds made flesh and walked through the frontier with a confidence that their parents had built one day at a time. The truth of them was a silver coin on a platform edge, and every single morning after that, the way she went out into the dawn and he brought his tea and stood beside her, the mountains receiving them both, the day beginning, the work waiting, the life good and real and entirely their own. Jacob Doyle and Snaga Frostwolf had started in the most brutal kind of beginning. An auction with empty air and a hammer going down on nothing, and a woman on a platform who had stopped expecting anyone to stand up. And then one man had stood up, quietly and without announcement, and she had exhaled, and the rest of their lives had built itself out of that single, irreversible breath. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.